Well, it is really good to be here with all of you today, and I'm going to do share screen here, and I've got a little slideshow I'm going to use to kind of accompany my comments. Here we are. A little disclaimer as I begin. So I'm going to talk about a topic today, more than preach on a text. And I'm looking at Professor Brooks. If my seminary professors were in here and not yours, they would really be unhappy with what I'm going to do today. But the text will fit in there, so we'll get to that. But I want to talk about the Stations of the Cross. So as a native Californian, I've had a lifelong interest in the extensive mission system that spanned the so-called El Camino Real, or the King's Highway, from north to south, beginning with the mission in San Diego, or the one named after St. James, in the southern border of old Alta California. It stretched north to San Jose, named after St. James, and then on to San Francisco de Dolores, named, of course, after the legendary St. Francis. Many of California's great coastal and some inland cities received their names from the missions started by the Franciscan friar, Father Junipero Serra, in the late 18th century. Good California kids all do mission projects in the 4th grade. I wish I'd saved mine. It was a travesty. But nevertheless, a part of that. Not long ago, I visited the northernmost mission outpost, Mission Sonoma, actually Mission San Francisco Solano, which was the last one to be established, and the dates noted here, in 1823. Now, Sonoma has many appeals, but one is the mission. It was not the first time I had been there. I still recall a high school field trip to the mission and to its setting, and later the first job interview that I had after seminary was to serve a little Presbyterian church in Sonoma. I didn't get that job, by the way. I really wanted that job. The mission church at Sonoma, like others in the network, is simple. I took this photo of the front of the church that includes a traditional display of the crucifixion and the bystanders at the cross. But I was especially drawn to the images displayed on the walls of this tiny chapel, the traditional images of the Stations of the Cross. It's inevitable for me, whether I'm in a grand and glorious cathedral or a more simple Roman Catholic parish, I look to see and follow the images, the representation of these so-called Stations of the Cross. The images at Sonoma were done in retablo style, and I didn't take a picture of those. They sought to capture with some imaginative fiction the painful journey of Jesus on his way to death, on his way to execution. Just over a week from now, many of us will follow a similar, likely very familiar pilgrimage from Maundy Thursday to Good Friday. The Passion of Jesus, the ancient steps along a route he took in Jerusalem, eventually enshrined as the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Pain, will be front and center for us. It's not a pleasant path, but one filled with pain and suffering. And we know something about pain and suffering at this moment. Horrific images from Kyiv, from Mariupol, or Bucha in Ukraine. Gun violence taking the lives of innocent folk, leaving a bar in Sacramento, not far from Sonoma. The relentless assault of the COVID pandemic still claiming its victims. We know something about pain and suffering. The passage from Luke's gospel this afternoon, and one that will be the text for many this coming Sunday, addresses a different part of the story. Palm Sunday, Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, the so-called triumphal entry. It's an easier story to tell, I think. The humble Jesus, not yet humiliated and broken, riding on a donkey. The crowds welcome him, as we heard. Hosanna, Hosanna, like a conquering hero. Those same voices will have a different cry later in that so-called Holy Week. This time when I visited the mission of San Francisco Solano, Sonoma, I stopped next door to visit the barracks. In the 19th century, these barracks were the headquarters for Spanish soldiers sent to protect and secure this northern outpost of their empire in the Americas. That odd, confounding, and too often diabolical juxtaposition of political power, of military might, and the mission of the church, it slapped me in the face. I just spent time looking at those images of the stations of the cross, of the suffering and abandoned Jesus, and crossed the street to the citadel of power, sent, of course, ironically and allegedly to protect the mission, the missionary and the soldier. Those two representations of colonial power, of staking a claim, of empire building, hand in hand, so telling and so tragic. It's a hard story to tell, and Hollywood often gets it wrong when they try to talk about mission, Christian mission, or any people's mission, with, in my opinion, one notable exception, the movie The Mission, that stars Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro. It's a classic. It's worth watching during Holy Week. Set in contested South American battlegrounds of Spanish and Portuguese power. As our attention has been drawn to this empire reclamation project of President Vladimir Putin in Russia, we know that nationalist aspirations have clearly a religious component there. It was his namesake, Vladimir the Great, who first claimed the Orthodox faith for his people just over 1,000 years ago in Kiev. But when Constantinople fell to the Turks in the 15th century, it was Moscow and its Grand Prince of the Rus who claimed for himself, for the very first time, Tsar of all the Russias. That was the so-called Ivan the Terrible. Like so many emperors since Constantine I, the claim was to both temporal power and religious authority. I was in Moscow doing a short teaching stint in the year 2001. Putin had just been elected president for the first time in 2000. It was clear to me, as it was to many Russians that I met, and many of them linked to a Methodist seminary that was in Moscow at that time. I think of those people even now. But it was clear to us that this former KGB operative saw Russia's Orthodox Church as his ally. Money was pouring into the church when I was there, and rebuilding projects were taking place everywhere. Now, I don't want to oversimplify a complicated situation in another part of the world, but there's little doubt that Putin fancies himself a so-called defender of the faith and has approached his efforts with religious zeal. but we know that story well here too. Re-energized forces of Christian nationalism looking to cloak their politics of power in Christian garb clearly threaten proper political discourse and violate the foundations of our faith. When the mantra of many Senate candidates in our state, in Ohio, is pro-God, pro-gun, pro-Trump, we know we have a problem. The suffering and rejected Jesus of the Stations of the Cross gets superseded by Christus Pantocrator, Lord of all the realms, reimagined as the champion of an old-time religion. I think many 16th century reformers, flawed as they may have been, got it right when they insisted that the theology of glory had suppressed the theology of the cross. So I want to return for a minute to my visit to the Sonoma mission before concluding with a few additional thoughts on the Stations of the Cross and how I see that fitting in. In the barracks, there was a display that talked about changes in California history, especially its eventual incorporation into the United States of America. Just outside the barracks, in the Sonoma Plaza, the Bear Flag Republic was proclaimed in 1846. When settlers claimed their independence from Mexico, this was the event. A panel inside narrated some of that story, and it's displayed here. Under the title, Manifest Destiny, the panel featured a quote from the journalist John O'Sullivan, and I'm quoting O'Sullivan. "It is the manifest destiny of this nation to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." And the panel continued with a few additional choice quotes. "Fired by political idealism and the prospect of unlimited opportunity on the Western frontier, Americans worked hard, prospered, and multiplied greatly. In July and August 1846, shortly after the beginning of the Mexican-American War, the Stars and Stripes were raised over California. Manifest destiny was triumphant, and 300 years of Spanish-Mexican control of the northern borderlands was at an end." End of quote. Wow. Can you believe those words? And we're worried about critical race theory? What is that? I'm thinking finally of the coastal Miwok people. We did our land recognition at the beginning today. That would have been their ancestral land. A proud and diverse group of First Nation settlers who inhabited those lands long before the Spanish, the Mexican, or any so-called Americans arrived. The Stations of the Cross that I saw would not have been in the chapel during their day, but we know they heard the stories of Jesus, these coastal settlers, the Miwok people. Jesus, the one who came to suffer with them and for them. Jesus, who entered Jerusalem, the holy city, in humility, riding on a donkey, on a burro. Jesus, who prayed for them in Gethsemane and for all those who suffer and are afflicted. Let this cup pass. Jesus whipped and scourged, no doubt, as they had at times, if they dared to defy their captors. Oh, but wait, no. Is this captivity? Was this mission? It gets so confused. Jesus, who stumbled and fell as he journeyed to the cross, there to be crucified, executed by those claiming political and religious authority. The way of the cross, the stations of the cross. It was no doubt a familiar story to these Miwok people, a story told to them, dare I say, perhaps beaten into them. That's the challenging and tricky thing about the stations of the cross. How do we make certain the story is about liberation for the captive and for the oppressed? How do we insist that the message of Jesus' painful journey validates human suffering and reminds us, all of us, how God journeys with us in the darkest of our situations? And how do we avoid thrusting the narrative or the obligation of suffering onto the most vulnerable and weak among us, making it yet another weapon in the arsenal of the oppressor? How do we avoid that story? The stations of the cross, they make me pause and reflect on how Jesus moves among us and addresses power in our world. I especially like the images and captions used by the Argentinian writer and theologian Adolfo Perez Esquivel. I've included here a link to his reflections on the stations of the cross. 14 plus 1, 15. I would take more time right now to kind of walk through those, but I think I'll just read the captions. I've got one here and encourage you on your own sometime during Holy Week to visit that site. Maybe Damon or somebody can put it in the chat. That's a part of this, and the rest of you can note what's on the slide. But here are these words that Esquivel uses as he talks about the stations of the cross. Number 1, Jesus' condemnation to death. 2, Jesus rejected and abandoned. 3, Jesus crushed by the weight of the cross. 4, mother and son meet. 5, Jesus is helped by an outsider. 6, Jesus identifies with the community of the oppressed. 7, Jesus falls to the ground a second time. Justice in the land. 8, the women cry out for justice. 9, Jesus falls a third time, identifying with the outcast and the abused. 10, Jesus is stripped of his garment as we strip the resources of our planet. Jesus is nailed to the cross. 11. 12, Jesus dies on the cross. 13, the deposition. Jesus taken down from the cross with those few still clinging to the hope of his promise in the world. 14, Jesus is entombed, returning to the earth, a womb. 15, the triumph of life. The stations.